Hello, everybody. Thanks for taking the time to join this Tether Tools webinar interview. If you've signed on to see and hear from Jeremy Cowart, you're in the right place. Good morning, Jeremy.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Afternoon, actually, for you. I'm in Phoenix, you're in Tennessee, and we've got people joining us from all over the globe interested in our discussion today. So at Tether Tools, we really kind of focus our company purpose in two areas. One is education, and another is empowerment. And for our discussion today, we really want to emphasize the empower side of that equation. The goal of the conversation is to really create some inspiration for attendees on where they can conjure up some creativity and purpose in their own career and in their life. We're going to hear how Jeremy's done that in his work. And since it's impossible to uncouple a photographer's creative process and their technical workflow, we are going to kind of talk a little bit about the techniques that Jeremy uses to create what are very stunning images in his work throughout his career. Jeremy, does that sound like a good plan to you?
That sounds great, man.
All right, we lost your video. Are you still, I don't know if you paused that.
Sorry, I lost your video too, so I thought I was supposed to lose mine.
I am still broadcasting. I can see you now. Can you see me?
I cannot. I just see your avatar, and I'm frozen on my own screen. So, so I don't know what's going on.
All right,
but if everything looks fine on your end, then I'm good.
Well, we are certainly live, and so for those people who looks like we've got people joining from Mississippi, Detroit. A lot of questions already coming in about some of the special projects that you've done throughout your career, so we'll cover some of those. And then we also have at least one person who's from Toronto, amongst many other attendees. So I do want to say, well, I'll be asking a bunch of questions. And thank you, Bill, for commenting. He can see us both, so that's good news. And we'll feel free to enter questions into the chat, and we'll cover those throughout the conversation today. Cool. So, Jeremy, really the premise of the conversation is based on your book, I'm Possible. And so that's a book that you came out with. Was it in 2019 that published?
Yep, that's right.
And talk to us about the title and sort of the play on words of the title and how that came about.
Yeah, I just growing up, I thought I couldn't do much, thought I couldn't achieve a lot. And, my life was a series of fails growing up, and didn't make good grades, thought I wasn't creative, didn't think I could do a lot. And so then I went to achieve a lot, overcame those hurdles. And then I realized that I wanted to do more with my life. So what could I do than just be another successful photographer? How could I use that success to help others in need? And so the book is really that story on finding success and figuring out what to do with it.
Yeah, well, and I think the title itself was really going with what you had talked about, your feelings and your sense of self when you were younger. This idea of things being impossible, now being about I'm possible, and right, what those opportunities are, how you can kind of reframe your outlook to focus on achievement, to find those opportunities for success. And that's a lot of what we'll cover. And so I do have some images that I'll pull up periodically so we can kind of talk about those. I think there's about 6 or 7 themes from the book that I took a lot of value from, that I think would be valuable for others to go away with, and just kind of think about how those themes apply to their current career in life, and then how they can sort of leverage this discussion to maybe reframe where they take those aspects of their life and career to find similar types of success. So on the point of that feeling of being mediocre, I do want to start the dialogue and the point in the book in college where you got a D in photography. And I think that's probably a shock to so many people who, for somebody who's been recognized as the most influential photographer on the internet, getting a D from a lot of people would be discouraging and say, I never intending to pick up a camera again. So, help us understand sort of where that stemmed from, and then how, you went from a D in photography to being the most influential photographer on the internet, and a little bit about, what changed in your life and your relationship with photography.
Yeah, well, first of all, I now cringe every time I hear that most influential photographer, because that was a long time ago, and it was for a brief moment. In 2020, I'm nowhere close to being the most influential photographer on the internet. But I guess there for a moment, according to a research company, I was for a second, 6 years ago. But yeah, I don't know, man. I just, just I kept digging into that curiosity, kept trying things, kept, failing over and over. I kept doing the dumb ideas, just kept exploring. And it turns out when you just start doing stuff, a lot of things happen to you, for the better.
Well,
And I'm still that way, just always exploring.
and as an educator, I would imagine that you probably encounter a lot of other photographers who similarly are challenged by those feelings of self-doubt, or the fear and the uncertainty, the questioning. In the business world, people talk about imposter syndrome. So how do you coach and give feedback to people who might be struggling with that same feeling?
Well, it's a very normal feeling to have. I mean, all artists are full of self-doubt and insecurity, and we all have our voices of, it's telling us that we're the worst and we suck and all that stuff. And so I've just learned that kind of part of the process. I mean, it's part of the gig is to wake up and have that resistance, facing you first thing in the morning. And I know it's going to be there tomorrow morning and the day after and the day after. And so, um, we're not going to overcome that. We're not going to beat the fear. We're not going to overcome those voices, but we just have to know that being a professional is living with those voices and having to learn to cope every day and just work through it.
Yeah. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up an image that I think is very representative of sort of like a style that is pretty unique to you, but also sort of highlights the theme of having a support network. And in your book, you talk about the strength that you get from your faith, but at a young age, you definitely saw and recognized support that you got from your parents, right? They didn't see you as mediocre. And then there was an art teacher, who really kind of helped support your early work as an artist. And then, of course, your wife throughout the book is really is on board and a big fan of Team Jeremy, regardless of whatever those creative ideas that you come home with or wake up with. But there was an interesting, professionally, I think you seem to really arm yourself and put yourself in a position to have the right support network around you. And I think that's important for people to hear about, right? It's never going to come to you always, and you can't always look to your family for it. And I think it was when you were early in your career as a web designer, you started an organization. And so maybe we could talk about that. I can't remember. There was like 3 numbers that it went by, and it was more of like a professional organization that you created.
The 615, yeah.
Yeah. So talk to people about why that came about, and a little bit about how you operated.
Gosh, this might be the first time I've ever been in a podcast where they've asked me about the 615. So well done. Well done on your research. That's impressive. Yeah, the 615, gosh, was really a group of web designers, mostly Nashville-based, thus the area code. And we were social media for each other before social media existed, truly. There was no social media of any kind. So this was early 2000s. And yeah, we would just basically email, reply all day long to each other. And, kind of started a support group for each other. And it was really is really helpful and really a way to share each other's burdens and pains and, mistakes and argue about Mac versus PC and, whatever the controversy of the day was, Nikon versus Canon. But yeah, it was really truly kind of that social media idea before it existed.
Yeah, and I think the thing that stood out to me was that you at that point felt you were surrounded by a number of people who, the conversation trended toward like negativity, or really more of too much emphasis on the problem, not enough on the idea and like the constructive nature of the conversation. And that to me was what stood out about why you and this group started and why it was established. And it almost felt like you had these rules of engagement that were really framed around, let's lift each other up, let's support those ideas, let's help encourage each other to drive those ideas forward. Is that a concept that you feel like you've since that time continued to kind of maintain and look for those people in your life that help drive that forward as a fuel to take those risks that you were talking about?
Yeah, for sure. I'm still very involved in the local community with other photographers, other entrepreneurs. I'm in a mastermind group with some guys. We meet regularly. I'm always trying to surround myself with other, creatives so we can share our issues. So yeah, the 615 still exists for me, just in different, formats. But I'm always. I feel like an artist is nothing without the support and of others, because it's such a hard journey, especially as a freelancer and especially during the middle of a pandemic.
Yeah.
So yeah, you gotta have that friendship support.
And I think social media platforms make it so easy to create that network in a place where that collaboration can happen. And I think the takeaway here is if you don't feel like you have that professional network of support, people who can like challenge you in constructive ways, it's important to go find it and establish it, right? To be able to share those ideas vulnerably, where judgment's not going to be passed, but people also be truthful with helping you kind of put that idea forward and even make it better. Let's talk a little specific about this image, because I think when you see it on the surface, the origin of it might not be as apparent to people. This is actually constructed out of some of your own art, but then a lot of your own original images and portraits you've taken, correct?
Yeah, it was really a random idea. To first, actually, I drew the lead singer of Radiohead, Tom York, in the same style. And then it was, I think, like a month later, it was Easter, and I was like, oh, I think I might, I might try the same thing for Christ. And so I drew this random portrait of Christ, and it kind of took off and became a thing. But yeah, it's kind of mixing photography, digital art, and physical art. And so, yeah, it was a fun first experiment. I've certainly explored the style a lot more since then.
Just for everyone's reference, how many photographs did you composite to create this final image? Do you recall?
That's a good question. Maybe 20, something like
Okay.
that.
Yeah, and if anyone's interested in sort of the process, you can go out on YouTube and search Jeremy Cowart and Christ portrait, and he actually filmed himself creating this and kind of going through that process. And it's a very interesting one to see him clip out eyes and beards and different sections of people's beards that produce this. And kind of one of the highlights, I think, is the crown, and that actually was a Burger King crown that was sitting on top of a child's head in like a classroom, right? Somebody had taken a picture and you pulled that into the photo.
That's right. Yeah, it was in my mom's classroom. Yeah, I took it off a kid's head and put it on Christ.
And then the layering, in Photoshop was something that I know you do a lot of. And so talk a little bit about how do you, when you use Photoshop and layers, it almost feels like there aren't enough layers in that final product, right? Like is that it? Talk a little bit about how you use Photoshop to kind of like stack and layer all these different looks and then make adjustments to get to a image you're happy with.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm a Photoshop user now, gosh, 20 something years. And, it's really become like an extension of my tools. I mean, I really do love to create in Photoshop or now Procreate on the iPad Pro. Also trying to learn Adobe Fresco. And so, yeah, it's, I don't know how to explain it. It just kind of go off, just kind of keep creating layers and seeing what can happen. I don't know how to describe the process, but it's more me than anything else I do. That's for sure. I definitely most feel the most alive, feel the most creative when I'm doing this type of work.
What do you, for you, when you're creating a piece like this, how do you know when you're done? Like, is it just a feeling or?
I remember being a kid and I was sitting in a classroom and there's one of those Garfield posters on the wall, if you remember those. And
oh yeah,
I'll never forget, for some reason, that's probably the only poster that ever stuck with me, or the only teaching of any kind that ever stuck with me. But the poster said, half of art is knowing where to start, and the other half is knowing when to stop. And your question is just so, such a good one, because I don't know. It's just instinct. It's just like you just get to a point where, like, okay, that's it. There's actually a girl on Instagram. Gosh, I'm spacing on her name. She's a teenager. She has special needs, I think Down syndrome, and freaking genius painter. I mean, truly, like unreal paintings. And it's so amazing because when she's finished, she just claps her hands. She says, I don't even think she says anything. She just, wipes her hands and she knows she's done.
And then she has that instinct of,
it's crazy. And I feel the same way. You just like suddenly arrive and you're like, okay. And it doesn't mean I love it. It just means I know that one's done. Yeah.
So where this definitely is, photography, but also art blended, in your actual photography business, some of your portraiture business, how do you determine when you've got that final shot? I mean, do you largely base it off of the client's decision, or like where do you push to know, like, I haven't quite gotten to my vision yet? I mean, how far do you push to get the shot you ultimately had envisioned?
It depends on the shoot for sure. Every shoot dynamic is so different. Sometimes I'm just there to push a button, and sometimes they are 100% relying on me and my creativity and my expertise. And sometimes it really is a collaboration. So, but yeah, I do always try to push as much as I can for the creative shot, even though I know that it will never see the light of day, because they're always going to use the most boring photos that get captured. So it's just science. That's the way it works.
So the next image that I wanted to share and theme I wanted to share has to do with the photograph that never should have been. So I wanted to bring to light this idea of breaking the right rules. And this shot came from, I guess it was like a tribute concert, and you were actually hired to do, I'm probably going to get the terminology wrong, but it was, basically environmental type photographs, like the crowd and what was going on.
Concert photos, yeah.
And so talk about how you were hired to do concert photos and ended up with a portrait of Sting.
Yeah, this was for Sony, and it was my first year being a photographer. And the art director hired me to come out for 3 days and just document the whole thing. Concert, live, stage, all that stuff. But she specifically said, do not shoot portraits of the artist. Whatever you do, don't do that. And I just thought, I'm never, ever going to be in a room with all these amazing artists again. So I'm going to take a risk and do it anyway. And so I set it backstage. And keep in mind, I had 3 days there, so there was a lot of downtime, where everybody's just kind of hanging out. So I went ahead and set up a little portrait station backstage downstairs and a little stairwell that nobody was even going down. So I had a kind of little private nook. And it was literally like feet away from the dressing rooms. And so I just kind of snuck back there and I would just start asking the artist for a quick portrait. And they all agreed to do it. And, so I did. And then a few days later, I finally kind of admitted to the artist or to the art director, said, hey, so I did end up shooting portraits of the artist. I know you told me not to, but I went for it. And she ended up being so glad because it turns out she didn't have the nerves or the, whatever to ask them herself. And so her telling me not to do it was mainly her being scared of what they might say or what they might, how they might react. And but thankfully I got the shots and she was super grateful.
Yeah. Well, so it's interesting that you brought up the environment, being a small set on a stairwell. I actually heard from one of the attendees a few days ago, someone who had signed up for this webinar, a gentleman named Jack, who's a actor, who said, I finally got some auditions. And he was interested, and he's kind of challenged where he's got to do some of his record himself, and he's got the need to sort of generate or create a small set. So, I mean, how do you manage a small set scenario, or what are the kind of critical things to be thinking about when you've got very little space to manage a set with?
Oh man, I don't know. It's always a shit show, It's you just gotta do it, and things might go wrong, gear might not work, but you just do your best and see what happens. And thankfully, I think most of the time that's where oftentimes creatives downplay the gear or the technical side of things, but and I used to too. I used to be guilty of just gonna I never said this out loud, but mentally I would think I'm just gonna live off my creativity, I'll be fine. And it was later that I was like, oh, the more you know, the more you learn technically, the more you can achieve creatively. And so then when you do arrive to those situations, whether it's staying or whether it's a minute to get portraits of the bride before the wedding, if you do know your stuff and know how to get the shot, then you're more prepared. And so, people really do have to learn all those gear manuals and study all the technical details, because that stuff really helps push the ideas and push the creativity.
So another comment from the book that went along with this is that you really that you have a willingness to break rules that limit creativity without reason. And so, are there other places in your career that you've encountered that you could share, where when there's not a good reason and it's limiting creativity, that it's a fair rule to break or bend?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of even just in March when I lost all my work and all my gigs and the pandemic hit, and I thought I was screwed just like everybody else. But then I started brainstorming, virtual photography. What does that look like? How does that work? And I launched the thing doing virtual photo shoots. It turns out it's amazing and so much fun, and it worked beautifully. And I did literally over 1,200 photo shoots in 39 countries in all 50 American states. If you would have told me that was possible in January, I never would have believed you.
Yeah.
But turns out it's doable.
Well, and I will highlight that and bring that idea back before we're done talking this morning, because I think it's worthwhile for everyone to see what you did. Ideas rich with purpose. And I think this is an interesting one where, I think often, people sort of wait for the ideas to come to them, right? They wait for somebody to come and say, I want you to shoot this. And that's when your creative process can start. And now you're just, well, what are the different ways I can do it? I think in the book you mentioned at one time taking a photo of a stairwell and thinking, well, how many different ways can you shoot stairs? Right. But you had that subject. A lot of your career was really saying, I'm going to go explore the idea with that purpose behind it, right? I'm going to create the idea, not wait for someone to come and say, here's an idea, and now what is your angle at it? And a lot of that ties to humanitarian work you've done. So let's talk a little bit about how that side of you, that part of your life where you've been to Rwanda and you've been to Haiti and any number of other places in the world. And I kind of want to hear. I believe this shot was from Haiti. Talk about what the draw was. What was the intent? What was the purpose that drove you to get involved in this? Because it's happened more than once in your life and in your career.
Yeah, this was 2010, and after the earthquake, I just really realized that I wanted to respond, and didn't know how. So, a long story short, I got a ride on a military plane down to Haiti and stayed with a guy I met on Twitter, and I just had the idea. I was like, I think people, their voices need to be heard. The media wasn't really sharing the stories; they were just sharing the stats, and so. And I'm not a journalist or reporter, but I thought I'd go down there anyway and have people kind of write out visual tweets, if you will. And Twitter was not a thing yet. It existed, but definitely not in Haiti. In fact, the guy I stayed with was the first person in Haiti to tweet about it. And so he was one of the very few that had Twitter yet. Anyway, so I thought, what if I could go down and give them this like social platform through written words on found rubble? And so we spent about, gosh, I feel like 10 days. We shot about 70 portraits, and I don't know what I was going to do with them. I just started sharing them on my own platforms, and it really took off. And more importantly, though, my goal with these projects is to always have them actually help the situation and not just shine the light on myself and my ideas. Thankfully, this project was discovered by the United Nations, and they ended up framing and hanging these photos for a very monumental day where the leaders of the world were all meeting and trying to figure out how to rebuild Haiti. And so they had to walk through this project, through my images, and hear these voices. And I know that $10 billion was pledged that day. And I have no idea how much my images moved any particular leader, but just to know for sure that they all saw the images and read the stories and got to experience the project before that meeting, that was certainly a goal accomplished.
Yeah, well, and I think there's a couple of items I wanted to comment on there. One, I get the sense that you're very clear on your own set of values and sort of you have your own, interests about, wanting to go and take this situation and do good, right? And find a way to create a positive impact. And that fueled the idea, right? You did not let any hurdles get in the way. Like you already mentioned, and I was going to comment, you just sent out a tweet saying, I'm going to Haiti. I need a place to stay. And someone said, you can stay with me. And this has happened more than once. It's highlighted more than once in the book. So I know, this is, you've not ever hesitated to ask for help in pursuing these ideas. And it seems like you always find willing participants and, again, willing supporters of the idea that help you pull it off. And so, from going to somebody who wrestled with mediocrity to someone who never hesitates to put out an idea and see how others latch onto it in a way that actually fuels the idea forward, it is interesting. But do you, in those asks, do you still feel trepidation and hesitation? Like, how do you overcome those moments to just put the ask out there and to put the idea out there?
I don't know. I just don't have that fear. It's a strange thing. It reminds me of, being a kid and having to walk into the haunted house, and you just kind of, there's certain kids that just won't do it or they're scared, and there's the kids that want to be the first to go into the haunted house. And I've always kind of wanted to be the first. And so anything involving stepping into the darkness, starting a new project, I'm not trying to pat myself on the back and say, look how brave I am, but I just don't have that fear to fail. A lot of my projects have failed. A lot of things that I've done haven't worked like I thought they would. But, society, people remember our wins. They don't really remember our losses unless you're like a politician or something. But for creatives, no one's going to know or even care or remember what we failed at. But they'll certainly, see what we succeeded in. So I just always come back and try to find another win. But yeah, with these, there's always fear, especially with a project that involves going to a third world country and working with people whose language I don't even speak. Certainly there's layers and layers of fear, or worries, or potential, problems, even just gear not working, or all kinds of issues, things being stolen. But I just go and do it and worry about the rest later.
Yeah, well, and I think that the reason I highlighted this and asked that question is, again, going back to so many people, a couple hundred people who are on this webinar, and those who will even watch the recording who wrestle with this, and knowing that just leaning into that idea and getting it started, oftentimes it seems to take on a life of its own, and then the idea starts to lead you in the right direction, and we'll kind of highlight that in a couple of other examples in this conversation too. Inspiration and frustration. You had a quote that said, "Look for frustration, or look for frustration," right? Because that's where ideas come from. So I won't put your own words in your mouth. I'll let you explain what that means.
Yeah, this project you're showing was a hurricane project, and like I mentioned a minute ago, I was frustrated with the media and how they weren't telling the stories as they should be told. And in this hurricane scenario, like, the media moved on and wasn't telling the stories anymore. So I thought, well, is it possible to, make devastation beautiful, so that you can photograph it and sell prints of it to raise money for the devastated? Can you literally take advantage of these horrific scenes and somehow turn it into fine art that another stranger around the world would purchase, and then give 100% of that money to the people that have to look at it? It's a strange thought and a little demented maybe, but that was the goal. And so I went down and did this Florida hurricane relief project. There's a lot more images from it, obviously. And all the type in these images was done in camera. I have to clarify that, because people probably think we just overlaid text into the photos. We actually used a pixel stick to project this typography in thin air, in the middle of the night. It was quite a quite an undertaking, to say the least. Anyway, but sadly, this is one of those projects that actually did not work in terms of getting the attention and publicity it so deserved. Because guess what happened the day we wrapped this project? It's crazy. The Las Vegas mass shooting. So
Wow.
As soon as we wrapped, that shooting happened, and the media was completely done with hurricanes at that point, and all anybody wanted to talk about was guns again. So, a lot of these projects depend on the media cycles and the timing of everything, and this was just bad timing.
So the point that you made about that, you had frustration, and then the idea was born in that, and I think that's Oftentimes people talk about that's how good products get invented, right? Somebody's frustrated and then they figure out how to close that gap. And I think that's a good technique when people are looking for that creative inspiration. What are the gaps that exist and unattended to, and then how, as an artist, as a creative, can you work to fill that in ways that aren't being filled? And so I don't know if you have, even in some of your commercial work, examples of how you've tried to fill gaps that you felt like helped you stand out as a photographer, to create a different way people are looking at portraits and other types of photography.
Yeah, sorry, you cut out there for a brief second. Repeat that last question.
So here's on the commercial side of your career, how you use that same find frustration to fuel that side of your business.
Oh gosh, there's all kind of frustration in commercial photography. I've actually I had an idea around that, because I was like, you make good money as a commercial photographer, but there's a lot of just red tape and rules. They can drive you nuts as a commercial photographer. So how can I make the same money shooting individuals in my studio, and not have any client or any rules or red tape or deadlines, and do it? And so I invented a new business model where I charge $250 for 15-minute sessions, which times 4 is $1,000 an hour, which is basically what I was making at a commercial rate. And so ended up doing, hundreds of those photo shoots, and then they were quick, they were easy. I got paid 100% up front. I got to edit how I wanted to edit. I got to deliver when I wanted to deliver. Like, it was insane. And again, that was turning frustration into positivity, and making something out of nothing.
Yeah, I remember you actually shared that example in one of your talks at Imaging USA this year on the Canon stage. That stood out to me as well. Kind of using your creativity to satisfy the career side, the livelihood of why you photograph, and then also the creativity and kind of doing things your way. So creativity comes through more than just what that final image looks like. And I think you have a lot of examples of how you've been creative with how you operate your business, and even share that willingly and openly with a lot of people. We were just chatting at the beginning before we jumped on live. You have a learning module on your website that talks about, what was the name of it again?
C University.
Well, you have C University, and then you have that one module where it was really just about the business side of photography.
The camera money workshop.
Yeah. Well, and so that's what I wanted to, again, another idea of showing creativity applied in a different way, where it's figuring out how to streamline just the getting paid in a faster, more efficient way, and then sharing that with everybody who wants to learn about it. So very, very interesting stuff.
Well, thank you.
So next slide, next idea I wanted to bring up. I don't know that everyone can see it because our video is in the way of the second part, but go far to go far, go together. You had shared a quote. I can't remember who, it might have been an anonymous attributed quote, but the idea of this kind of goes back to the support concept, right? If you want to, and then I think the actual quote is, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So tell us about this photo, sort of how it got pulled off, and then we'll explore the theme a little bit of that go far, go together.
Yeah, this was taken after the Gatlinburg wildfires a few years ago. They really decimated Gatlinburg, and Gatlinburg is a place that I've visited a lot growing up, and it's a wonderful, wonderful little quirky town, and I have really special memories there. And so anyway, when it was, when the wildfires hit, I wanted to do something. And then I randomly had an idea for using drones to, capture people laying in their former homes from 300 or 400 feet high, laying on an empty white mattress, in the remains of what their house once was. And so, again, I just went and did it. Found a crew, found help, kind of self-funded that project, and just did it. And didn't know what I was going to do with it, didn't know what the plan was, but thankfully it, found the right home. Actually, Time magazine ended up, covering it, and as well as a lot of other press outlets. And so, again, my goal is just to help and to tell a story. And like I said earlier, my goal is always I want the people to be glad. I want the people to be, I want the story to help. And so I'm so honored that this project is permanently installed as a little walkable museum in the top of a mountain in Gatlinburg. And so
Yeah.
I think forever, literally, as an old man, I can go back and visit this. They have this museum up on the top of a mountain that's really cool. But it's just, that's always should be the goal of any photographer. It's like, how do you not make this about you, but do something in a really compelling, but just do it in a way that actually helps tell the story and helps raise money. Like we built crowdfunding pages for all these victims, and so the goal of the project was to actually point people not through me, but directly to their crowdfunding pages to raise money for them to rebuild their homes and move on with their lives.
Yeah, and I mean all of these images you can find either on Jeremy's website or on his social media pages, and they're striking. And you kind of complemented these overhead shots with portraits of some of the same people. And the point about the going together that I think I wanted to pull out here is somebody did ask the question about, is the point just do it and then worry about it later? And I think there is a bit of that in some of the projects that you've been describing. But I think more so it's about getting the idea out of your head and to rally other people around it too. Because I think that's when you have to rely on not just your own resourcefulness, but the resourcefulness of others who are willing to help and support it. And I think with this specific series and this project, you went out to social media and you were looking for, it turned out that somebody that you went to college with, her dad was the mayor of Gatlinburg. And so that's how you were able to get hooked up with the mayor to be able to talk about this project and start to the wheels in motion to help.
Yep. Yeah, it's crazy. I just again just start reaching out to people, and little did I know that my friend, her dad was the mayor of Gatlinburg, and so it was a sweet connection that was just kind of serendipitous.
Yeah. Another sort of humanitarian project, and the idea that I wanted to bring forward here, actually you've already highlighted a little bit. You mentioned with the Haiti example that you really wanted to let people tell their own story, and outside of preparing for this conversation, I did get a lot of value from the book, and I've talked to people, my wife and some others, about the content, because it's sort of a memoir and an autobiography to some extent. It's so much more than that. When you read it, it feels like it's a history lesson in some regards, and when the stories are being told, it's really you're hearing stories and perspective about people and about these events but through the eyes and the words of the people who experienced it. And I would say that when you look in the totality of all of these examples, there's a commonality there to your work, where really what you've done is used photography as the means for people to tell their own story. Would you agree with that sentiment?
Yeah, absolutely.
And why? So, and then do you see how that, does that translate to some of your other work too, outside of your humanitarian work, where it's almost like the people say in portraits or headshots, right? Like the person reveals themselves, all right, that their look, their essence, their being. As a photographer, how do you do that? Like, how do you let that come out and let the person, tell the camera what it needs to capture?
That's a good question. Yeah, especially now that I've been shooting just portraits in my studio, it's hard. I mean, sometimes I feel like I fail miserably and I don't capture the essence of the person. Whereas sometimes like all the stars align and you are able to get that out. I know Annie Leibovitz, she's not really a director. She kind of sits back and lets things unfold, and which I thought was surprising because you always hear that photographers are supposed to direct and like pull out of the subjects exactly what they want, and I've never really related to that, and so it's kind of like a breath of fresh air when Annie said that she doesn't direct, because I really don't either. I just kind of like create the environment. I'm such a technician that I'm so focused on the composition, the lighting, and the color, and the editing, and the projection. I shoot with projectors. I have a million things going on in my head, and so it's hard for me to think for the subject as well, which some would say is the most important part, but that's not how I operate. But obviously I do direct people and try to, if I can tell they're literally a deer in headlights, I will try to pull something out of them. But my favorite shoots are when they're doing their thing, I'm doing my thing. It's truly a collaboration, and I am able to just capture the real them because I'm not trying to pull something out of them. I'm just letting them be who they are.
Yeah, well, and I think in doing that, you've really been able to sort of create that style and that narrative for your own work as a photographer, and it's sort of being clear on what are the kinds of the kind of work you want to do, the kinds of photos you want to capture. In a way, that's how you embrace your story, and a big part of that is letting others tell theirs, which again, and when you read the book, you lose sight of the fact that this is Jeremy Cowart talking about his life and career, because you do get transported into these different places with these different people who have tremendous resilience through tragedy. So forgiveness and reconciliation, we'll kind of touch on this briefly, and because I think going along the lines of failure, right? And the idea that this actually came out of a project you did with like child soldiers, right? And so talk to us about what this project was, and then how you approached it with the children that you worked with.
Yeah, gosh, this is one of my favorites for sure. Yeah, I went over to Uganda with my friends at Exile International. I did a project that wanted to collaborate with kids creatively, and so I had them draw their stories. Back then was on a big fat Cintiq Wacom tablet. I think it was like a year later that you could really draw on an iPad, and that would have been a lot easier than carrying a 30-inch monitor around the remote bushes of Uganda. I mean, literally, if you could have seen us loading.
Did they make a backpack for that carries that?
No, It was like took 2 or 3 of us every time to carry that freaking monitor on and off the bus, out in the middle of nowhere, out in the heat, 100 degrees. It was a nightmare. Anyway, iPad would have been a lot easier.
Yeah.
But yeah, I had them draw their stories, and then I would we'd interview them. I'd take their pictures, and then I would come back and kind of create these digital collages similar to that earlier portrait of Christ, and then we'd sell the prints and give the proceeds back to the organization that went over there.
Yeah. So I think it's a great project, and like hearing the story is really profound. And I think for me, the reason I highlighted it is mistakes are going to be made, right? And to your point, like not everything works out. Forgiveness is important to others, but also self-forgiveness, I think, is really important. And knowing that, as people, we're imperfect, and being able to like reconcile that, to be able to move on, right? So that you don't get in the way of yourself, of the next idea that's worth pursuing.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring this back, and it's come up once. And by the way, somebody did mention that as of March, you deserve to be known as the most influential photographer on the internet because of projects like this. So Love Transported was that virtual photo shoot that you had talked about. You talked about being a technician. Just kind of talk to everyone about the equipment that was involved in pulling off these shots, because it wasn't, you mentioned a projector, but it wasn't just one projector.
Yeah, this was a really wild idea. I got inspired by people doing FaceTime photo shoots and thought that was cool, but wanted to kind of do my own thing. But more importantly, I wanted to get paid for it. At that time, when I had the idea, no one was charging for it. And I thought, well, we all need to still make a living. So how can I do this as a business? And so had the idea to project, basically FaceTime calls. I was using software called Crowdcast instead, projecting them onto a vintage canvas and then photographing the canvas. But I was using 2 projectors. One was projecting the person, the other was projecting like my iPad. And so I would like live create these weird textures. It was a trip. And each photograph that came out was super unique, and kind of did its own, had its own vibe. I mean, literally every single portrait was brand new. And yeah, I did I did 1,200 photo shoots, which has to be some kind of world record. In a month, we did 1,200 shoots. I was doing the first 3 sessions I did were 100 photo shoots at once. So you literally shoot, each group for 2 or 3 minutes, sometimes up to 5 minutes, and on to the next one. And photographing 100 photo shoots took about 5 hours. So
I know when we chatted maybe a week or 2 into this, you mentioned you went down to like 40. You were capping it, which I can imagine shooting 100 in 5 hours is exhausting, and
it was
that self-care becomes important, taking a break.
Because you're not only hosting, but the amount of technical things I was managing was more than I've ever managed in my career. I mean, you're talking 2 laptops, 2 projectors, Capture One Pro, Crowdcast, and you're dealing with the other person's internet connection speed and their cameras and telling them how to fix their lighting. And I mean, it was good grief. It was a cluster. Then you got people trying to get their kids to stop screaming, and it was a nightmare.
The other part I liked about this was the evolution of, it started with the style on the far left where you were projecting into a frame. And then I think you figured out how to project, was it onto plexiglass? So you could kind of get that full frame portrait?
Yeah, well, no, it was on It was on canvas, and the plexiglass didn't come around until the Black Lives Matter project.
Okay, well, we'll touch on that in a second. But the other part of that
Yeah.
too is then going from shooting one person to multiple people who were in different locations. So the shot in the middle are, you know, is a grandmother and then her grandchild who she hadn't seen. And so, you know, I think the idea here was you just let that inspiration, that creativity continue to snowball, and you didn't just stop with the one idea. You continued to let it evolve, which kept it interesting, probably for yourself, and then everybody else who, like me, who was watching online as it was unfolding.
Yeah, it was it was crazy, man. I'm still actually doing them, still offering them. We just do it once a week now, every Thursday, but not nearly at the pace I was going, thankfully.
Well, you know, so today is Tuesday. Sounds like there's a couple of days for people to sign up, and if
Yeah.
they're interested in taking part in this. All right. So then you mentioned the Black Lives Matter portraits, and so I did want to share that as well. And so, you know, talk about this one, and then like the way that you approach it. This is another great example of letting people tell their own story.
Yeah, this was gosh, one of my favorite projects as well. Just to be in the studio and having all these new friends come in, and you know, the idea was to photograph them through a sheet of plexiglass with the Black Lives victims, the black victims being projected in front of them, and then letting them protest with their own, you know, handwriting behind them. So again, using two projectors to pull this off, it was a really another technically loaded idea, but it came out more beautifully than I could have hoped for. Because you know, when you're shooting through an image, you don't know, especially with different f-stops, like what if it's going to really read, if it's going to be too blurry, and so I was really thrilled with how this came out.
Yeah. Well, and I think to me, what you know, it takes all of the noise around racism, Black Lives Matter, and you know, any of the politics that can be involved in that, and it really just sheds light on the humanness involved, because it's a person with a message and a story and a experience to tell, or you know, a family. And I think that's where you connect differently as a person with the movement, and you know, seeing of what this is really about. And I think, you know, that is something you achieved with this project, who a few people have noted in the chat was really powerful.
Yeah, thank you. Even the image you're showing, like it looks like that's a strand of hair coming out of her head, but that's actually the cops, you know, or the I'm sorry, not the cop. That was just the neighbor and his shotgun, you know, coming out of his hand. All those happy accidents were truly accidents. You know, just you never know the way images are gonna overlay on top of each other. But yeah, all of that was done in camera.
Yeah. Well, so as we sort of wrap up our time, Jeremy, I wanted to end with a project that I want you to talk about, but it also encapsulates a lot of this whole journey. So, you know, in going from, you know, having the right support network to breaking the right rules, and, you know, owning your story by letting others own theirs, you know, the ideas rich with purpose, you know, bringing all this together into, you know, one of your maybe longest standing and biggest projects of all time. And I'm couching it under this idea of failure to learn, right? So failures come up a couple of times. Talk about willingness to fail, talk about this project, and then talk about where you learn through failure to persevere and then keep good ideas alive.
Yeah, well, this idea is a big one. I had an idea to build a hotel chain, gosh, in 2012. Spent 3 years in fear of it because it was so big. Then in 2015, we decided to launch Kickstarter, but that would require an insane amount of work just to do that. So that didn't launch until 2016. And then that took us through 17 to like ship everything and fulfill that whole thing. And then but yeah, it's a monstrosity of an idea to build a global hotel chain, and now even harder that the hotel industry has been decimated by COVID, but we're still making great progress. But yeah, it just like again trying to finally the idea process, living with that fear, but knowing when an idea just doesn't go away, when it's there every day, just constantly like knocking on your head, like you got to do this one, got to do it, got to do it, got to do it. And everyone you talk to says the same thing. Like you just know that it's like, okay, 3 years of, hearing that every day. It's like, okay, it's time to actually pursue this. And so, again, not having any clue how to do it, not having. Can you still hear me, by the way?
I can, yes.
Okay, my video froze up on my side. And one of my AirPods died. But yeah, just finally decided like, okay, this has to happen, and we're gonna go for it. And so I don't know if I'm even answering your question, but
Yeah, well, so I think with it, I wanted people to know about this because it shows how the most audacious ideas are still worth pursuing. I think in your book you highlight this. There was a point where you labeled this as a failure because you did a Kickstarter campaign to try to raise money and you fell short of the goal. And so, it failed. But then you kind of reset, refocused, and tried it again with some, a few slight adjustments, and then had a successful campaign that got you some of the early funding needed to get the idea off the ground. And my impression in hearing and seeing how this is played out in the book is that you have hit way more hurdles than you would have ever expected, but that purposeful idea is there, and again, leaning into it, getting it out of your head and in front of more people has just created a situation where you have a number of individuals who are enthusiastic about it, not just supporting you, but also supporting the project itself. And so I think that's what I really wanted to come out of this idea and that specific project. And when people can stay at a purpose hotel, that they should look at it.
yeah, there's a lot of exciting stuff happening right now. I wish I could share everything, but it is happening.
Yeah. So Jeremy, we're at an hour. I've really enjoyed talking with you about your career, some of these projects that you've allowed us to highlight. A lot of these are ongoing, and so the book "I'm Possible" is available for people to buy or download, and they can check out more of your work on your website. They can check out Purpose Hotel. Help Portrait is another ongoing project that still plans to do it this year. I know it's usually the first week of December that you do that. Is that something that you're still planning to do this year?
I don't know about this year due to COVID, so we'll see, but maybe.
Maybe they'll all be virtual.
Yeah, exactly.
Jeremy, thank you so much for the time. A pleasure. And you are about to embark out on vacation, so enjoy that. And we'll watch for the landscape photographs on your social profiles to come.
All right, sounds good, man. Thank you for having me.
All right, thanks so much.
All right,
bye.
See you. Bye.